What if I told you that Indonesia and the Philippines were once part of the same mighty empire? An empire so powerful it controlled the world's most valuable trade routes for over 600 years. An empire that historians have deliberately hidden from you. The truth will blow your mind. Picture this: massive fleets of warships stretching across the horizon. Golden palaces rising from jungle islands. Merchants carrying treasures worth billions in today's money. This wasn't ancient Rome or China. This was Southeast Asia, and it was ruled by an empire you've probably never heard of. The Srivijaya Empire. But here's what nobody tells you. This wasn't just some forgotten kingdom buried in dusty history books. This empire shaped the modern world in ways that still affect your life today. Every time you use black pepper, every time you buy cinnamon, every time you smell cloves or nutmeg, you're touching the legacy of an empire that once made kings tremble from India to China. And it all started with one man's impossible dream. The year is 671 AD. A prince named Hayang Srivijaya Nasa stands on the shores of Sumatra, staring at the Strait of Malacca. This narrow waterway is the choke point of Asian trade. Every merchant ship carrying silk, spices, and gold has to pass through here. Most people see water. He sees opportunity. But here's the shocking part. This wasn't just about controlling ships. It was about controlling information. In the 7th century, knowledge was power, and the Strait of Malacca was the information superhighway of the ancient world. Every trader, diplomat, and scholar who wanted to travel between India and China had to stop in Srivijaya ports. They brought more than goods. They brought news, technologies, religious ideas, and military secrets from across half the world. The Hayang realized something that would change history. Whoever controlled this strait didn't just control trade, they controlled the flow of human knowledge itself. And this is where everything changes. Within 50 years, Srivijaya had become the most powerful maritime empire in Southeast Asian history. But they didn't conquer through armies marching across land. They conquered through something far more sophisticated: naval supremacy. Their war fleets were unlike anything the world had ever seen. Fast, maneuverable ships that could strike without warning and disappear into the maze of islands that stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. But what nobody tells you is how they built their empire. It wasn't through brutal conquest like the Romans or Mongols. It was through something much more clever: economic domination. Here's how it worked. Srivijaya would approach a coastal kingdom and make them an offer they couldn't refuse. Join our trade network, pay tribute, and become rich beyond your wildest dreams. Or watch your economy collapse as we redirect all trade away from your ports. Most rulers chose wealth. Those who didn't discovered what Srivijaya's navy could do to uncooperative neighbors. By 800 AD, this empire stretched from modern-day Malaysia to the southern Philippines. Dozens of kingdoms paid tribute to the Maharaja of Srivijaya. Their ports bustled with merchants from Arabia, India, China, and beyond. But here's the part that will shock you. The Philippines wasn't just connected to this empire. It was a crucial part of it. The Visayan Islands, Mindanao, even parts of Luzon, they were all integrated into the Srivijaya trade network. Filipino rulers sent tribute to Palembang, the empire's magnificent capital. Filipino warriors served in Srivijaya fleets. Filipino merchants grew wealthy carrying goods across the empire's vast territory. For over 400 years, what we now call Indonesia and the Philippines were essentially one economic and political unit. And then something happened that changed everything. But before we get to that catastrophe, you need to understand just how advanced this empire was, because what archaeologists have discovered will blow your mind. In 2009, researchers diving in the waters off Belitung Island made a discovery that rewrote history. A 9th century shipwreck filled with treasures from across the known world. Chinese Tang Dynasty ceramics, Middle Eastern glassware, Indian textiles, precious metals from Africa, all on a single ship sailing under Srivijaya protection. This wasn't just trade, this was globalization, 1,000 years before Europeans even knew these places existed. But here's what really shocked the researchers. The ship's navigation equipment was more sophisticated than anything Europeans would develop for another 600 years. Star charts accurate to within degrees, magnetic compasses that pointed to true north, detailed maps showing currents, winds, and safe harbors across thousands of miles of ocean. The Srivijaya Empire had created the world's first truly global trade network. And at the heart of it all was a secret that would make modern corporations weep with envy. What nobody tells you is that Srivijaya didn't just control the spice trade, they created it. Here's the genius part. Many of the world's most valuable spices, nutmeg, cloves, mace, only grew in the remote islands of what is now eastern Indonesia, the Moluccas, or Spice Islands as they became known. Srivijaya rulers made these islands exclusive suppliers. They controlled every ounce of spice that left those islands. They set the prices. They chose the buyers. They created artificial scarcity that drove prices through the roof. A single pound of nutmeg was worth more than a pound of gold in medieval Europe. and every gram had to pass through Srivijaya hands. But here's where the story gets even more incredible. The empire's rulers weren't content with just controlling trade. They wanted to control minds. Srivijaya became the greatest center of Buddhist learning in Southeast Asia. The world's most brilliant scholars came to study in their monasteries. The most sacred texts were copied in their scriptoriums. They were building something unprecedented, an empire that conquered through culture as much as commerce. Chinese pilgrims traveling to India to study Buddhism stopped in Srivijaya for months, even years, to learn from masters who were considered the finest teachers outside of India itself. But this cultural power came with an unexpected consequence that would ultimately doom the empire. And this is where everything changes. By attracting the world's scholars, merchants, and diplomats, Srivijaya had made itself incredibly wealthy and sophisticated. But they'd also made themselves a target. Other powers began to notice this rich, peaceful empire that seemed to have unlimited wealth and no apparent military threat to their neighbors. The first signs of trouble came from an unexpected direction. The Chola dynasty of southern India had been watching Srivijaya's growing power with increasing alarm. These weren't just any Indian rulers. The Cholas had built their own powerful navy and controlled much of the Indian Ocean trade, but Srivijaya was cutting into their profits. In 1025 AD, the Cholas struck without warning. What nobody tells you is that this wasn't just a simple military campaign. It was one of the largest naval expeditions in medieval history. Hundreds of Chola warships appeared off Srivijaya's coast like a nightmare made real. They attacked simultaneously across multiple fronts, hitting major ports from Sumatra to the Malay Peninsula. But here's the shocking part. The attack succeeded not because the Cholas were stronger, but because Srivijaya had a fatal weakness. Their empire was held together by wealth and voluntary cooperation. When that wealth was suddenly threatened, the whole system began to collapse. Local rulers who had been loyal tributaries for centuries suddenly saw an opportunity. Why pay tribute to a weakened Srivijaya when they could keep all the profits for themselves? One by one, the empire's vassal states began to break away. But the real death blow came from somewhere no one expected: the rise of new trade routes that bypassed Srivijaya entirely. Arab and Indian merchants had been developing alternative pathways to China that avoided the Strait of Malacca altogether. They sailed directly across the Indian Ocean, stopping in Ceylon and southern India before heading to Chinese ports. Suddenly, Srivijaya's geographic advantage became irrelevant, and this is where the story becomes truly heartbreaking. As their empire crumbled, the Srivijaya rulers faced an impossible choice. They could try to hold their remaining territory together through military force, becoming the kind of brutal conquerors they had always avoided being. Or they could accept that their time was over and try to preserve what they could of their civilization and culture. Most chose the second option. What followed was one of history's greatest dispersals of knowledge and culture. Srivijaya's scholars scattered across Southeast Asia, taking with them centuries of accumulated learning. Their merchants established new trading companies in dozens of different kingdoms. Their craftsmen taught their skills to local artisans from Burma to Brunei. But here's what nobody tells you about this diaspora. It didn't just preserve Srivijaya culture. It spread it far wider than the empire had ever reached at its peak. The legal systems, architectural styles, artistic traditions, and maritime technologies that Srivijaya had perfected over 600 years became the foundation for dozens of smaller kingdoms across Southeast Asia, including the kingdoms that would later become modern Indonesia and the Philippines. And this brings us to the most shocking revelation of all. When European colonizers arrived in Southeast Asia centuries later, they found a region that seemed to be made up of dozens of small, competing kingdoms with no connection to each other. They were wrong. What they were actually seeing were the scattered pieces of the greatest maritime empire in Southeast Asian history. The trading networks, the navigational knowledge, the cultural connections, the shared languages and customs, all of it traced back to Srivijaya. When the Spanish conquered the Philippines, they weren't just conquering isolated island kingdom. They were destroying the last remnants of a 1,000-year-old empire. When the Dutch colonized Indonesia, they weren't unifying separate territory. They were reassembling pieces of something that had been unified long before Europeans even knew these places existed. But here's the part that will make you see modern Southeast Asia in a completely different light. The connections that Srivijaya created never really disappeared. Even today, if you know what to look for, you can see the empire's fingerprints everywhere. The architectural styles of ancient temples in Java match those found in Filipino ruins. Traditional boat designs are nearly identical across Indonesia and the southern Philippines. Trading practices, marriage customs, even cooking techniques show unmistakable similarity. Most telling of all, the languages. Linguistic researchers have discovered that ancient trade languages used across the Srivijaya Empire evolved into the foundation for modern Bahasa Indonesia, Malay, and dozens of Filipino dialects. When a Filipino and an Indonesian meet today, they often find they can communicate using words that their ancestors used to conduct business across the Srivijaya Empire 1,000 years ago. But here's what really blows my mind about this story. Modern DNA analysis has revealed something extraordinary. The genetic connections between Indonesians and Filipinos aren't just the result of recent migration or shared ancestry. They are the result of 1,000 years of intermarriage and cultural exchange during the Srivijaya period. The empire didn't just unite these territories politically and economically, it united them genetically, which means that when politicians today talk about Indonesia and the Philippines as separate, unrelated nations, they're ignoring a fundamental truth. These aren't separate peoples who happen to live near each other. They are literally the same people, divided by artificial colonial borders that have existed for only a few centuries. And this realization leads to one final, mind-blowing revelation. What if the Srivijaya Empire never really ended? What if it just went underground, preserved in the cultural DNA of hundreds of millions of people across Southeast Asia? Think about it. The ASEAN economic community that exists today follows almost exactly the same trade routes that Srivijaya established over a millennium ago. The same products move along the same sea lanes, connecting the same ports, serving the same markets. Modern container ships follow the same monsoon patterns that Srivijaya navigators mapped out in the 8th century. Indonesian and Filipino workers migrate back and forth across the same waters their ancestors crossed when the region was united under a single empire. Even the cultural exchanges continue. Indonesian pop music is hugely popular in the Philippines. Filipino television shows have massive audiences in Indonesia. Young people in both countries learn each other's languages, date each other, marry each other, create families that span the old imperial boundary. The politicians may have drawn lines on maps, but the people never really accepted that those lines meant anything fundamental, because deep down, in their bones, they remember. They remember when this was all one place, one culture, one people, one empire. And maybe, just maybe, that memory is starting to surface again, because here's what nobody talks about in all the discussions of modern geopolitics and rising Asian power. The Srivijaya Empire was proof that Asian civilizations could create something truly great without copying Western models. They built a maritime empire that lasted longer than Rome. They created a trade network more sophisticated than anything in medieval Europe. They developed technologies that wouldn't be matched by the West for centuries. And they did it all through cooperation, cultural exchange, and mutual prosperity instead of conquest and exploitation. In a world where everyone assumes that empires must be built on military domination and cultural suppression, Srivijaya showed a different way. They proved that you could unite vast territories and diverse peoples through shared economic benefits and respect for local custom. They demonstrated that maritime empires could be more stable and longer-lasting than land-based ones. They created a model for globalization that enriched everyone instead of concentrating wealth in the hands of a few. And then they were forgotten, erased from history books, ignored by scholars who preferred to study European empire, dismissed as irrelevant by people who couldn't imagine that anything important had ever happened outside of Europe, China, or the Middle East. But the truth is starting to emerge. Archaeological discoveries are proving that Srivijaya was far more advanced and influential than anyone realized. Linguistic studies are showing that their cultural impact spread across half the world. Genetic research is revealing that their legacy lives on in the DNA of hundreds of millions of people. And geopolitical analysts are beginning to understand that the rise of modern Southeast Asia isn't a new phenomenon. It's the return of something very, very old. The return of the Srivijaya world. A world where the narrow straits between Indonesia and the Philippines aren't barriers that divide nations. They are highways that connect peoples. A world where diversity isn't a weakness to be overcome, but a strength to be celebrated. A world where prosperity comes not from conquering your neighbors, but from trading with them. That world existed once before. For over 600 years, it was the most successful civilization in Southeast Asia. And now, as artificial colonial borders begin to matter less and ancient cultural connections begin to matter more, that world is coming back. The Srivijaya Empire may have fallen 1,000 years ago, but its ghost still haunts the waters between Indonesia and the Philippines. And maybe, just maybe, that ghost is about to become very real again, because empires built on mutual benefit and shared prosperity have a way of outlasting empires built on conquest and exploitation. They may be forgotten for centuries, but they never really die. They just wait for the right moment to return. And that moment might be right now. The next time you see a map showing Indonesia and the Philippines as separate countries, remember this story. Remember that these lines were drawn by colonial powers who never understood the deep connections that unite these peoples. Remember that for most of recorded history, this region was united, prosperous, and peaceful under indigenous rule. Remember that the Srivijaya Empire proved that Asian civilizations could create something magnificent without European guidance or Western model. And remember that the greatest empire in Southeast Asian history wasn't destroyed by superior firepower or better technology. It was forgotten by people who assumed that anything truly important must have happened somewhere else. Now you know better. Now you know the truth about the Srivijaya connection, the connection that made Indonesia and the Philippines one empire. An empire that shaped the world and then vanished from history until